The air inside the studio was electric even before the lights went up, with Stephen Colbert pacing through his usual pre-show routine, cards in hand, witty remarks already forming behind that familiar smile. But tonight was different, not just because of the guest, but because of the unspoken tension that had been building all week leading up to Karoline Leavitt's appearance, a former Trump press secretary turned rising political commentator who had made headlines recently for her scathing remarks about mainstream media bias, censorship, and what she described as the leftist stranglehold on cultural discourse. And though the invite to Colbert's show had been extended under the premise of open dialogue, no one behind the scenes was naive enough to believe this would be a civil tea party, least of all Karoline, who arrived with her chin lifted, her black suit sharp and precise, ready to deliver her message to an audience she knew would likely greet her with skepticism, if not outright hostility. And when the segment began, it seemed at first like Colbert might keep things light, joking about her age, her sudden rise in conservative circles, even calling her a TikTok-era firebrand, which drew laughs from the crowd but a tight smile from Karoline, who said, "I didn't come here to trend, I came here to tell the truth." And Colbert, never one to back down, leaned forward and replied, "Then let's get to it, what exactly is your truth?" And thus began a tense exchange that escalated faster than the crew anticipated, with Karoline calling out the late-night landscape as political theater disguised as comedy, and accusing Colbert directly of pushing an elitist narrative that mocks working-class values while cloaked in moral superiority, to which Colbert chuckled, "You mean like telling jokes for a living while also worrying about democracy?" And Karoline fired back, "No, I mean using your platform to shame half the country for voting differently than you," which drew both boos and applause from the audience, and for a moment, it felt like the entire studio had stopped breathing as the two locked eyes across the desk, neither blinking, neither softening. And what followed was a flurry of verbal blows dressed in rhetoric and sarcasm, Colbert accusing Leavitt of carrying water for a man who tried to overturn an election, while she retorted, "And you carried water for a media machine that buried stories to protect your political favorites." And at one point, when Colbert asked if she believed Trump lost the 2020 election fairly, Karoline answered, "I believe the American people have every right to question irregularities, and shame on you for mocking their concern," which prompted an audible groan from the audience and a sharp, almost cutting response from Colbert, "Shame on me. I'm not the one trying to gaslight a country into forgetting January 6th, and at that moment, Karoline stood up, pulled off her mic, and said, "This isn't conversation, this is ambush under studio lights." And though Colbert tried to interject, she waved him off and added, "You don't want guests, you want villains to punch," before turning and walking off the set to stunned silence, the camera catching her retreat for a split second before cutting to commercial. And from that moment, the internet exploded, clips circulating with headlines like, "Karoline walks off, Colbert vs. Leavitt, the clash we didn't expect," and "Is late-night TV still a space for dialogue?" With conservatives praising Karoline for standing her ground and liberals accusing her of crumbling under basic scrutiny, while the show's official account posted a carefully edited version of the segment that left out the abrupt exit, prompting even more speculation and accusations of selective editing. And within 24 hours, Karoline appeared on several right-leaning podcasts and news outlets, declaring that she had been set up for spectacle, not substance, while Colbert, ever the satirist, opened his next monologue with, "I had a guest last night. She left early. I guess free speech has a curfew," which drew laughter but also criticism for what some saw as dismissive sarcasm in the face of a real media failure to foster constructive debate. And behind the scenes, executives debated whether to tighten future guest screenings, as staffers admitted that while conflict had always been part of the show's DNA, this particular clash had crossed into uncomfortable territory, not because of the politics but because of the breakdown in basic human exchange. And meanwhile, Karoline's walk-off only boosted her profile, leading to new followers, new speaking invites, and a sudden branding as the voice they tried to silence, a label she leaned into during speeches at conservative think tanks and youth summits, while liberal commentators continued to dissect every word she and Colbert exchanged, arguing over who was right, who. The days that followed Karoline Leavitt's walk-off from Stephen Colbert's set weren't marked by silence but by a carefully orchestrated surge of response that felt less like public reaction and more like a cultural tremor, as if the fault lines exposed in those 7 chaotic minutes on live television had cracked something deeper in the collective discourse. And while Colbert remained predictably tongue-in-cheek in his next few episodes, mocking the moment with snarky one-liners and inviting comedians to reenact the walk-off as exaggerated melodrama, something in the audience reaction told a more complicated story. because even among his usual progressive viewers, a growing number began to question whether entertainment had entirely devoured substance, whether the environment on these shows still allowed for any kind of uncomfortable honesty that wasn't pre-approved by the ideology of the room, and Karoline, for all her polarizing views and conservative fire, became the unlikely face of that question, her name suddenly not just trending among political influencers but whispered across campuses, coffee tables, and media panels by people asking not whether she was right but whether she had been treated fairly, and this shift, small, nuanced, but undeniable, only fueled her media strategy, as she began appearing not just on right-wing platforms like Newsmax and Breitbart but was now being invited to more neutral podcasts and moderated town halls where her presence guaranteed heated viewership, and yet, for all the attention, she remained largely silent about Colbert himself, refusing to re-engage in a back-and-forth that she called, predictably juvenile, instead pivoting to broader talking points about media elitism, ideological gatekeeping, and what she dubbed, the culture of curated outrage, and by the second week after the incident, she had launched a new initiative called The Uninvited Table, a digital panel series hosting conversations between people from opposing political ideologies without moderators or applause signs, which drew initial skepticism but quickly went viral when her first episode, featuring a retired Obama strategist and a libertarian economist, racked up over 3 million views in 48 hours, and though critics still doubted her motives, few could deny the momentum she was building, not as a partisan firebrand but as someone repositioning herself as the anti-pundit, and this growing influence soon attracted the attention of larger media organizations, with one surprising moment occurring when NPR invited her to appear on All Things Considered to discuss the breakdown of civil debate in modern discourse, and while her answers were calculated, precise, and media-trained to perfection, her final remark, civility doesn't mean agreement. It means not clapping when someone else is cornered, landed across social media with thunderous resonance, shared by both supporters and critics alike, because in that sentence she had articulated the very discomfort that many felt watching her segment on Colbert's show, the sense that something had shifted from tough questioning into theater, and Colbert, for his part, began to feel the pressure in subtle ways, his next few political guests noticeably softer, his monologues weighed with the kind of self-awareness that suggested not guilt, but awareness of critique, and behind the scenes, according to anonymous CBS producers, there were serious discussions about how confrontational segments were handled, with even longtime staffers admitting the Karoline episode had hit differently, because unlike other confrontations, she hadn't been visibly rattled, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't fired back with anger. She had simply refused to stay seated in a format she no longer believed respected her as a guest, and that image of her standing, unhooking her mic, and walking off without flinching had etched itself into the consciousness of a media generation, becoming a kind of meme, but also a metaphor, for the limits of performative engagement, and meanwhile, within political circles, her reputation transformed from controversial to essential, with several senators privately citing her as an example of media pushback with teeth, and rumors began to swirl that she might be considering a congressional run herself, though she dismissed it in interviews with a practiced smile, saying, "I'm not here to run, I'm here to reframe," a phrase that soon found its way onto her merchandise, digital banners, and speaking invites, and all the while, Colbert remained Colbert, never apologizing, never directly addressing the deeper criticisms, perhaps because to do so would imply a level of complicity he wasn't willing to concede, but even among his colleagues in late-night media, the conversation was shifting, with subtle jabs emerging on rival shows, where hosts like John Oliver and even Seth Meyers began inserting meta-comments about how we treat our guests when the cameras are rolling, and this behind-the-curtain reckoning didn't just stay in comedy, it echoed across editorial rooms, university forums, and even newsrooms at outlets like CNN, where roundtable discussions now included segments on echo chambers in infotainment, often citing the Colbert-Leavitt clash as a turning point, not because it was so outrageous, but because it revealed how fragile our systems of discourse had become, where even the illusion of open dialogue could collapse under the weight of a few unscripted minutes. And as for Karoline, she continued building her empire of dissent, now working on a book tentatively titled Frame Wars, Speaking Truth in a Pre-Written World, and while some dismissed it as another vanity project, early leaks of the manuscript showed a tone less defensive than expected, more reflective, surprisingly vulnerable in places, especially in the chapter where she admitted that part of her walk-off wasn't rage but exhaustion, a moment where she realized that nothing she said would be heard as intended, that she was not a person in that chair but a prop in someone else's narrative, and in that realization, she did the only thing left in her control. She stood up and left, and whether one agreed with her politics or not, that simple act reclaiming the right to not be misunderstood, resonated in a way that transcended party lines, and thus, what began as a clash on a comedy show transformed into a parable for an entire media generation, where optics and honesty no longer lived comfortably in the same room, and where sometimes, the loudest voice is the one that leaves the conversation entirely.